In his opening statement, Victor Stenger presents 4 arguments which he says prove with certainty that God does not exist. Well, can he maintain that high standard of proof? Let's look at the arguments. First, he alleges that the attributes of God are self-contradictory. Now, this is actually my area of specialization as a philosopher, so I was very interested in hearing his arguments here. Unfortunately, we heard merely assertions from Dr. Stenger. I was looking for the argument. Where were his premises? What was the argument that supported these assertions? I don't think that any of the alleged contradictions that he asserted are in fact incompatibilities with each other. For example, take God's perfection versus God's being a creator. According to the Christian view of God, God created the universe for the benefit of the creature, not for his own benefit, not from any imperfection in himself, but rather it is a creation so that we might come to know God, the joy and blessedness of personal relationship with him. So that creation, just like salvation, is totally by God's grace. It is an expression of his overflowing love. The knowledge of God is what we were made for as human beings, and we find our ultimate fulfillment in knowledge of him. He says, what about transcendence versus omnipresence? Well, traditionally, omnipresence has not been interpreted to mean that God is diffused throughout the universe like some sort of invisible ether. Rather, omnipresence means that God is causally active at and knows what is happening at every point in space. And that's entirely compatible with his being transcendent and the cause of space and time. What about his justice versus his mercy? Here I find one of the greatest beauties of the Christian faith is the reconciliation of God's justice and mercy. They meet at the cross. At the cross we see God's love for humanity expressed as the second person of the Trinity dies in our place to take upon himself the death penalty of sin that we deserve. He voluntarily undergoes the most excruciating suffering to reconcile us to God. And yet at the same time we see the justice of God as God's just punishment for sin is meted out, but he takes it upon himself in the person of Christ, so that the justice and the mercy of God meet at the cross. At the cross we see the most beautiful reconciliation and expression of the mercy and justice of God. Finally, what about immateriality versus being personal? Well, I would invite Dr. Stenger to give any argument to show that persons are essentially material beings. On the contrary, I would say that persons are essentially immaterial beings. We are souls conjoined with a body. God is an unembodied soul, if you will, or mind that transcends the universe. So there's no incompatibility there. So I think philosophers generally recognize that the traditional concept of God, at least as Dr. Stenger has attacked it, is entirely coherent and compatible, and the question is there evidence for such a being? Well, his second argument was that the evil in the world is inconsistent with the existence of an all-powerful and all-loving God. Again, he merely asserted this, but I would like to hear the premises to the argument. Philosophers have come to recognize that there is no logical inconsistency between the propositions an all-powerful, all-loving God exists and evil exists. And if Dr. Stenger thinks he can show those are logically inconsistent, then I'd simply invite him to do so. It's generally recognized that no one's been able to show those propositions are inconsistent. In fact, you can actually prove that they're consistent by adding a third premise, namely, God has a morally sufficient reason to permit evil. So long as that is even possible, it follows that those propositions are entirely compatible. The atheist seems to think that if God has morally sufficient reasons to permit evil, then I must somehow be privy to these. But there's absolutely no reason to think that I must know God's mind or know all of the reasons that he has for permitting the evil and suffering in the world. So unless Dr. Stenger can show that it is impossible that God have morally sufficient reasons for permitting pain and evil in the world, his argument is simply invalid. Second thing I would say about this is that I think that paradoxically evil is actually proof of the existence of God. The argument would go like this. If God does not exist, then objective moral values do not exist. Second, evil exists. Namely, some things are really wrong. 3, therefore objective moral values exist. 4, therefore God exists. So while on a superficial level, evil seems to call into question God's existence, on a deeper, more philosophical level, evil actually proves God's existence, because in the absence of God, good and evil as such would not exist. Dr. Stenger's third argument was that naturalistic explanations are preferable to supernaturalistic explanations. Well, it may surprise him to hear me say that I entirely agree with that. Whenever you have two explanations that are available, a naturalistic one or a supernaturalistic one, I would say as a methodological principle, you go first with the naturalistic explanation. And it's only when the good naturalistic explanation is not available that one would be justified in preferring a supernaturalistic explanation. But Dr. Stenger's real complaint is that a supernaturalistic explanation is no explanation at all. He says just to say God did it doesn't explain anything. But you notice that wasn't the structure of my arguments. My arguments, many of them, were deductive. That is to say, if the premises are true, then the conclusion follows logically and inescapably, whether you like it or not, whether you think it's explanatory or not. For example, everything that comes into being has a cause. The universe came into being, therefore the universe has a cause. And then you do an analysis of what is to be a cause of the universe. Or, if God does not exist, objective moral values do not exist. But objective values do exist, therefore it follows logically and inescapably that God exists. So when you're dealing with deductive arguments, it really doesn't matter whether you like the explanation or not. As long as the premises are true, the conclusion is logically inescapable. As for the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus, this was a hypothesis that forms the basis of an inference to the best explanation in terms of the standard historical criteria used for historical justification, such as explanatory power, explanatory scope, plausibility, and so forth. And I think in every one of the cases that I enunciated this evening, we do have good grounds for inferring what we could call a supernatural explanation. Finally, number 4, he says that God's action should be observable in the world. And what I would respond to that is that there is abundant evidence of God's actions in the world. In fact, what I would say is that the very existence of the universe itself is abundant evidence for the existence of God, as I explained. If God exists, what greater evidence should we expect of his being than the origin of the universe out of absolutely nothing at some point in the finite past? The fine-tuning of the universe to an incomprehensible precision for the existence of intelligent life. The existence of an objective realm of moral values. The resurrection and radical claims of Jesus of Nazareth, and the interpersonal experience of God himself. Dr. Stenger, to carry his argument, would have to show that if God existed, we ought to have more evidence than that. And it seems to me that that's just pure speculation, pure presumption. So I think we have quite good evidence for God's existence, and therefore none of his 4 arguments are sound. Now, what about the reasons that I gave? I'd like to advance these a little bit further. First, the argument from existence. Here, the question is the very existence of the universe. Even if you say the universe is eternal, the question is, why does an eternal universe exist rather than nothing? You have to have a necessary, transcendent being that is the sufficient reason for why anything exists rather than nothing. What about the argument from the beginning of the universe? What brought the universe into being? Well, in his book, Dr. Stenger proposes that the initial instant of time, t equals 0, is not only the beginning of our time, but it is also the beginning of a backward growing time as well, as in figure 1. And he takes this to be equivalent to an eternally existing universe with no beginning. Unfortunately, Dr. Stenger's scenario is self-contradictory and incoherent. For on his theory, t equals -1 is supposed to be after t equals 0. But by drawing negative time on the same axis as positive time, t equals -1 also turns out to be before t equals 0, which is self-contradictory. Since t equals 0 is supposed to be the beginning of both time dimensions, in order to avoid contradiction, Dr. Stenger should have drawn the 2 time axes perpendicular to each other, as in figure 2. But then it's obvious that on his model, it doesn't avoid the absolute beginning of the universe. Both dimensions of time have an absolute origin at t equals 0, and therefore I think the model doesn't avoid the question of what brought the universe into being. What about the argument from fine-tuning?